In a country far away, a young man goes to a monastery to start his life as a monk. 1 year has passed. Our young monk goes and sees the head of the monastery. And he said to him, "Thank you for letting me stay here. I've learned so much about myself, but there is one thing that still bothers me. Every time we sit for meditation in the garden, I see a monk carrying around a cat on a leash. And then he tie the leash to the tree in the center of the garden. And I wonder, what's the source of this ritual? Why do you do it?" The head of the monastery, a very old monk, looked at him smiling and said, "Oh yeah, the cat. It started about 60 years ago. Back then, we didn't have the buildings and the walls that you see around us. We were just sitting and meditating under the open sky. One day, a cat came from the nearby village and walked between the monks, distracting them from the meditation. So the head of the monastery at the time asked one of the monks to put a leash on a cat and tie it to a tree so it won't distract them on the meditation time. Our young monk was confused. He said, "Well, now you have the walls, so you don't need to do that anymore." But even more than that, it was 60 years ago. It's not even the same cat. You just brought another cat, so you will have something to tie to the tree. It makes no sense. And for that, the old monk replied, "Yes, this is true. But look, it took you a whole year to come here and ask me this question." So we left the cat here as a lesson for young monks like you. I love this story, and not just because it has all the right ingredients like monasteries and cats, but mainly because it's a story about ourselves. It's about the thing that we do, the choices, the habits, and it makes us ask ourselves, do I choose the things that I do, or am I just working automatically without thinking about it? And by now, you're probably wondering, why this guy with the funny accent talk to me about habits in a dev conference, right? So my name is Yuval Bar Levi. I'm very excited to be here. It's actually my first time in Germany ever. I love philosophy. I work as a senior web developer at Canopy, where we build a platform to help cancer patients get a better treatment. And I'm the founder of Haiku, a fully remote company specialized in web technologies. We provide consultant and development services. In those two roles, in the last few years, I had the chance to see lots of different projects, from very small ones of startup companies to large ones with lots of teams and hundreds of pages. And in all of these projects, there was one problem I kept seeing. Totally different problem, totally different project, same problem, and it drove me nuts. And I told myself, I have to get to the bottom of this, to understand why it happens and what we can do about it. And the problem is this. Building UI starts easy, but at some point it sucks. It's just getting messy, and we have different colors and font sizes and spacing and shadows in different parts of the application, and we change something in one part and it affects something completely different, and everything becomes tedious and take longer than it should be just to keep the visual aspect consistent. And at some point you might think, maybe I should just refactor the whole thing, start from scratch, and this time I'm going to make it right. And maybe some of you did. And maybe you find yourself in the same situation 1 year later. So I seen this problem in many forums, and it sent me on a journey to understand that. And one of the things that I learned in this research of mine is that it's not just a technical problem, it's also a human problem. It's about us. It's about the choices we make and our habits. So we're going to get to the technical UI part in a few minutes. But first, let's talk about habits. Think about your habits. Habits shape our lives. Think about the things you did this morning. You brush your teeth, hopefully. You maybe had coffee or had a morning run, yoga, whatever you do in your morning routine. And each of these actions by itself, it's had a little effect on your life. But when you do it day by day, week by week, for weeks, for months, for years, it's had a great impact on your life. These habits, the automatic things that we do without even thinking about it sometimes, these are the things that shape our lives. And if we can choose the right habits, we can shape our life the way we want to. And to connect the habits to our problem, we need to go a little bit back to the 90s, the happy days. Back then, we didn't have Facebook or smartphones. We used things like DVD, and ICQ was a big thing. And in the 90s, software engineers used the waterfall methodology, which means we used to think about software engineering like any other kind of engineering, which means first we gather all the information, and only then we start implementing, do the work. Think about building a house. First, we need to know where it's going to be located, how many floors, what's the specification in terms of structures and weight and support, etc., etc. And only then we start digging the ground and lay the foundation. Now, these days, software engineering just doesn't work like that, right? Because if we compare it to building a house, it's more like we start building the house. At some point, we realize we need to build it in the other side of the street. And instead of 3 floors, we need to build it with 6 floors. And we end up with something like this, right? Because it doesn't work like that. It's too much more complex, and it's required adaptability. And we move to working in the agile methodology, which means that we prefer reacting to changes instead of over-planning. This is one of the reasons we prefer shorter development cycles when we work agile, right? And it works, it's great. 20 years later, we still work that way. But there is a problem here. And the problem is that it makes us tend to plan less for the long run, which makes sense, because if we don't know what we're going to work on, what we're going to build 3 months from now, how we can plan how our code should look like 1 year in the future. So I call it the agile effect, the tendency to plan less for the long run when we work agile. And I'm going to demonstrate that using this dating app for cats. If you have a lonely cat at home, there are plenty of cats here looking for a relationship, I'm just saying. So let's talk about symptom number 1 of this agile effect, the duplication of design tokens. Design tokens are all these little values we use in different parts of the application to set our visual aspect. The colors, fonts, sizes, shadows, and so on. When you look at this part of the page, it might seem like the different parts all have the same kind of blue. The application bar, the border of the card, and the button. But when we look closely, we'll see there are different kinds of blue. It's not the same color, actually. And that's happened in real application, large-scale application as well. Why? Because the way we work. We start to build a component, and then we build the next component, and we copy the code from one component to the other component, and to the next component, and at some point, we change one of these values, and we end up with lots of different values, lots of different colors. Nobody knows why, not even the designer. Maybe it happens in your application, not with color, with something else, font size, whatever. Please raise your hand if you know what I'm talking about. If you have something like that in your application, maybe it's spacing, maybe something else. Look around you. That was almost all of you. Symptom number 2, duplication of components. Imagine you need to add a search feature to one of your pages. So you take a text box and a button, and you add some logic, and it works. Wonderful. 1 month later, you need to add a search feature to another page. Sometime, we remember we did something like that about a month ago and we refactor it. But a lot of the time, we just copy and paste or do something similar in our code, especially when we work in teams. So sometimes we don't even know our teammate did something like that about a month ago. So this is number 2. And number 3, unintentional variance. What do I mean by that? I've collected these buttons from the same application. They're supposed to look the same, but when we look closely into the styles, we'll see they're not exactly the same. Some of them have different background color, some have different spacing or different font size. And why is that happening? Kind of a result of symptom number 2. We copy and paste the button, and at some point, we inject a style. So it's a combination of copy and paste of the components and lack of isolation of the styles. And you might think to yourself, well, OK, we know these issues. We're seeing that. How bad can it get? I mean, the application is working. There is nothing functional here. How bad can it be? So let's talk about that. In the first few months, it's going to be easy peasy. You won't feel like you're having a problem. But if you give it some more time, a few more months, up to a year, you will start seeing the cracks. And when I say that, I mean you will have these annoying bugs and issues of inconsistencies. Like, for example, you will get a ticket to change some of the colors of your buttons to what you actually need to have as a color. You need to change the background of the button to the primary color of your application. All these annoying cosmetic issues. And if you keep neglecting that, you might enter a phase I call 50 shades of gray. Not just because it's painful, but because it is something I've seen in an application I was working on. We had so many different values of the color gray. Nobody knew why, not even the designer. And we managed to reduce it to 4 different levels of gray, 4 different values. But it took us a long time to fix that. And that was just one color. So it takes some time to fix that. And if you keep neglecting this problem after a long time, you might have a totally different level of problem. It's going to be much more painful, like the problem GitHub had in 2015. Now, in 2015, GitHub codebase contained 2,449 different hex values, different colors that were not connected in any way. Just think about this number, almost 2,500 values in unmanageable way. How that's going to affect the way you work, I mean, your daily tasks, when you work in such a mess. How long it takes you to fix something like that? That's going to take a long time. And that's just the colors, right? There are other visual aspects. So this can get really bad. If you want to know more about the problem GitHub had and how they solve it, you can hear a talk by Diana Mounter. She's the head of design in GitHub. I left the link for that talk in the end of the slides. So I looked at these different issues, and I asked myself, what's the source of these issues? What are we missing here? Or what can help us solve these problems? Remember I told you I love philosophy? There is a word in Sanskrit, manas. And manas relate to a certain aspect of the mind that has the ability to see the reality as it is, which means seeing the big pictures and the small details at the same time. You can imagine yourself standing on top of a mountain so you can see everything around you. And in the same time, you have a powerful telescope in your hand so you can see all the details of the things around you. You can zoom in. Now, if we can cultivate this kind of mental vision and always remember when we work on our feature, we are part of an entire system, that can be useful. But it's kind of hard to work like that, that every thing you build, every line of code, you think about, OK, this should be a part of an entire system. How can I do it better? And for that, we have a tool, design systems, which are great. I'm fascinated by design systems. Design systems are a combination of style guides and rules, documentation, and digital assets, icons, reusable components. Let's see an example. Primer is the design system created by GitHub. if you look into the action page, you will see all the components we all know from the GitHub pages, like our avatar and the forks and the stars and so on. And if we zoom in, it's going to look something like this, a bit overwhelming. But what you can see is we can see the entire thing, the whole picture. And we can drill down and see all the specification for specific components, like a button. These are all the different states of a button. So with this kind of documentation about everything, we can build our reusable components. We can create a collection of reusable components. It have different names for that. They're not exactly the same, but the idea is that at some point we want to refactor it and create a component library or any other name you like to use. So that's going to make them reusable and isolated, because it's going to be a separate library, although in most cases it's going to start as a folder in one of your projects. So if we can create this UI kit according to our needs, that's going to solve our problem. But we have a problem just about that. We, most of the time, won't have design system ready, at least the documentation part, when we start writing our first line of code. But what if I say you can build your UI kit as you go? You don't need to stop everything you do. You just keep working, and it won't require more time. You don't need to spend more time doing that. You just need to change a few things in the way you work. I'm going to talk mostly about buttons and colors, because it's easy to demonstrate on buttons and colors. But these habits and guidelines we're going to talk about can work for any kind of component, forms, pop-ups, dialogues, tooltips, whatever you need. I'm going to talk about habits and guidelines of engineering, not about specific technologies. Now, I'm going to demonstrate them using React and Sass, but you can use whatever you want, CSS in JS, Angular if you insist, Angular with CSS in JS. You can use them all the same. And it's going to be easier if you just starting a new project. But even if you work on an ongoing project, you can still implement these guidelines. It's going to take you some time to get the result that you want, but it's definitely possible. Actually, this is what we do at Canopy these days. So let's talk about the first issue, duplicate design tokens. And this is a naive approach to styling a button. You just put the values in line. And a better way to do that would be to create a file for our typography variables, create a file for our colors, and we will import them to wherever we need and use that. But there is a little problem here. I mean, it's going to work. If we change the value of the blue, it's going to affect the entire application, right? But the problem is, what if we want to change the value to something which is not blue, like lime green? So we can still change the value. It's affect the entire application. But when we look at the code and we see blue, which actually means now green, that's going to be confusing. And we can rename the variable, but that means we need to change it in many places, maybe hundreds of places. So a better approach might be to add another layer of functional names, primary color, get the value of blue, and we use the primary color in our button class. So even if we need to change the primary color, we change it in one place, and everything works, and it's good. But I looked at that, and I was thinking to myself, well, that's pretty basic, right? I mean, this technique is easy. Everybody who sits here knows how to put a value into a variable. Yet when I ask you if you know this problem, if you've seen this in your application, everybody, almost everybody, rose their hands. So what is actually happening here? And I realized that it's not about the technique, which is easy. It's about the way we work. Think about what is one of the first thing, or the first thing you do when you want to implement a new feature. You look at the exist code, right? Some people say that the most important skill for a developer is to know how to copy and paste from Stack Overflow, right? Yeah, but actually, most of the time, we copy and paste our own code. We want to maintain our own code, and most of the time, we want to keep it as it is, the same formation. Refactor is hard, keeping it as it is easier. And we can use that. So my point is, choose your default carefully. Whatever you're going to do early in the project, that can take you a long way. In this case, it means create a file for your values of colors or font size as early as you can, but you can use it to anything you want. So choose your default carefully. Duplication of components. Now, most of the time, or a very common pattern would be to, when you get a new design or a new wireframe for a page, is to first create the page and only later down the road refactor the reusable parts. But what if we change this order and first, when we get a new page design, we create the reusable parts and use them to create our page? And this is where atomic design methodology becomes useful. Atomic design divides the application into different levels of complexity. The names of the layers, they don't matter much. What's important is the different layers of complexity. I'm going to demonstrate what I mean with the same application. The atoms here are the smallest parts, or the smallest components, like buttons and links, a text box, an icon, avatar, and even each of these text can be created as a typography component. We can take a few atoms and assemble a molecule from that. So we can take an icon and a text box and create a search component. We can take a few links and create a navigation bar, take different type of typography components and create a text block, and even take a few molecules and atoms and create a more complex molecule from that. So up the tree, there is the organisms, which are more complex part of the application that stands by their own, like the entire application bar. There are the templates, which are just layouts with placeholders for our content. And there are the pages themselves. Now, the important part here is that if you recognize these two top layers and we implement them completely, this basically means we just created our UI kit for this feature. So we can recognize that, spot them, implement them first, and create them in a reusable way and use that to create the page. How it works in practice. Actually, we don't even need a complete design for that. A wireframe would be enough, something like this one. And when we look at it, we can just break it down. So first, we're going to spot the big parts, like the entire application bar or a card. And we can break it down. In the application bar, we spot the navigation bar, and we spot the search component. In the card, we'll spot the text block. And we can break each of these components down a bit more. So we'll spot the navigation, the link, and the icon, the avatar that stands by itself as an atom. And we can break the text blocks into different typography components, and we implement them, put it in your UI kit folder, and use that to create your pages. So point number 2, go atomic, use atomic design to create your UI kit first, and use that to create your pages or your features. And lastly, unintentional variant. It's this problem. We have all these buttons that's supposed to look the same, but they're not. So I looked at that for some time, and I asked myself, what's the source of this problem? And I think is that we have too much flexibility. Now, that's kind of weird, isn't it? Because I think we tend to think about flexibility as a good thing. I mean, I know I do. I love JavaScript. It's one of the most flexible programming languages in the world. But that's exactly the source of some of our problems. That's why we invented TypeScript, right? Because you can build create a function, pass anything to it, and that's a problem. So we use TypeScript to limit the flexibility of JavaScript. And in the same sense, we can create our UI kit not as a very flexible collection of components, but rather very strict, because it needs to fit our needs and our styles. And that's it, not more than that, nothing more than that. OK, I get this slide just to get your attention, because this is the most important part of the talk. So may I have your attention, please? Thank you. OK, let's look at a way to design a button. Let's create a button. We're going to use TypeScript, which is a way to limit our components flexibility. And we have this interface. We set an onClick, which is an event handler. We can pass down a class name. Why? Well, sometimes we need a text, and then we had a button, and we want to add some space between them, right? So it can be useful in some cases. And we have the children, React nodes, and we chained the class name to the primary button, which is the original class of the button, and that's about it. And obviously, this is a very naive way to build a button if we want to keep the style isolated, because we can abuse that very easily. Instead of passing down something that adds a margin, we add a padding, and that's going to make our button longer, and it's going to change how it looks like. So we lose the consistency with that. So you might think, OK, we just remove the class name property. And that's about it. I'm curious, actually. Any of you use something like this? Like you inject styles with class name prop? Some of you? Little few? OK, yeah. We use that. That's a common pattern, unfortunately. But when we remove that, we still haven't solved our problem, because we can still inject style into our component, something like this. We can set our children to be anything. We can add a wrapper to our text, and we're still able to add a left padding class, which is going to change the way our button look like. So nowadays, I write components more like this. The code is the same. Just notice that the children has type of string. So now I can pass only string as a children. And if I'm going to pass anything else, it's going to fail. And maybe you ask yourself, wait, you said there is a text and a button. You need to have a space between them. And this is true. And we can still do that. But my argument is that it's not part of the responsibility of the button. It can be set by a wrapper. You don't have to do it like this. But a button should have a single responsibility. And that is to handle a click, to be a clickable surface. Anything else can be used and like to be refactored and be done by something else, by other component. So we can do it like that. What if we want to have a different type of content, like not just a text? Sometimes we use icons in our buttons. So we can do something like this. We pass down children, which is string, icon type, which is one of these values. And we have a full control about how our content would look like. So I reduce the inconsistencies when I work this way. Now, typography is part of almost every application. And this way of working encourages separation of concerns. So we can even make it like that the button don't need to set the font size or what kind of font is it. We just use a different component. We use a typography component. And actually, we implement just that at Canopy. We used to have lots of different font sizes in different parts of the application in many places. And we moved to just using typography component. And it's worked great. It's much more consistent, and we don't need to fix nasty stuff all the time. So now my button just in charge of the click. Even the style of the typography, it's not the responsibility of the button, which is great. Now, we can measure how flexible our components are. For example, let's say we have this typography component, and we want to add another prop to it, a color prop. And I have several ways of doing that. I can pass down a string, and I'm going to use the value of this string, the hex value, and just set it as the color. And I'm going to have about 16 million type of values, which is a lot. A better way would be to pass down a color type, which has 4 different options in this case, or even a Boolean flag. If alert is true, the color is going to be red. Otherwise, it's going to get the default. You don't have to choose the last one, which is very strict. But my point is, when you add another prop to your component, you can measure the flexibility and choose the least flexible option, like take option 2 or option 3. Don't take option number 1. That's my point. So we talked about flexibility and how to measure it and separation of concerns. And if you're going to work this way, you're going to end up with lots of components, but each of them going to be more simple and smaller. So it's going to be easy to compose and construct together. And if I want to summarize these different points we talked about, I would say make your component easy to use, but make them difficult to change. Easy to use means less props. When I have less props, my component is easier to use. But wait, didn't we say we work agile, so things change all the time? What do you mean? You build that way and you don't need to change your UI kit? So how making the component hard to change is going to help us? And obviously, our UI kit is going to change at some point. Design systems and UI kits are a living concept. But the thing is, when we make them difficult to change, it's going to help us spot the dilemma. When I get a new design, sometimes I can get new values of colors or different variation of a button, let's say. And if my components are flexible, I can just implement that easily. But when it's difficult, when I have to do something in order to add a color to my UI kit, it makes me stop and wonder, hold on, do I need to change my UI kit, or is it just a mistake? Maybe I can use the exist color or the exist buttons. Maybe it just happened to be this way. Because eventually, we all make mistakes, right? Even designers sometimes. I mean, this is the reasons we have QA. So we need to validate the design that we get. Which brings me to point number 4. We should take more responsibility about the code that we implement. When we get a new design and it's not according to our exist UI kit, there are two options. Either it's a mistake, or we need to add something to our UI kit, and it's make us choose between them. And we need to validate the design that we get. And also, we need to communicate that, because this is not something you're supposed to do by yourself. You're supposed to share this concept. If you want to work this way, share it with your team. But not only with your fellow developers, but also with your product and designers and UX, UI team. Because eventually, we all want the same thing. We all want to create better products, more consistent, that are easier to maintain. And in case you wonder about this picture, yes, this is our team doing a sprint planning. Let's wrap it up. We talked about Agile and how it makes us plan less for the long run, and that Manas can help us see the big picture, think about the entire system when we plan our code. And the way to do that is using design systems and UI kit. And we talk about the problem that we don't have design system in most of the time before we start coding, so we need to build the UI kit as we go. And guidelines that can help us do exactly that is to choose our default carefully. For example, set a file for your design tokens early as you can in your project. Go atomic. Use the UI kit first. Use atomic design to build your UI kit first, and use that to build your application. Make your component easy to use, but difficult to change. And lastly, code responsibility. Take responsibility about your code and about the implementation of the design, and communicate with your teams. This is an acorn, a seed of an oak. In this state, it's very small. You can hold it in your hand. But if you put it in the ground, and it's lucky, and you wait a few years, you may end up with an oak tree up to 40 meters height and can last hundreds of years. And my point here is this. It's easier to choose the place for your acorn carefully than to move the tree a few years later. And that goes for our habits. If we choose the right habits for us in our work and in our lives, that's going to take us a long way. Thank you.